Hey there. Welcome to Midnight Sleep Crime. I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know many of you use this video to fall asleep. So, before you get cozy, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'd love to hear from you. Story 1. In the quiet suburbs of Ashwood Lane, children begin vanishing one by one. Each disappearance is marked by the same chilling clue: a crudely drawn chalk figure left on the sidewalk near their homes. Neighbors whisper of a figure in the night, a man no one has ever truly seen but everyone claims to know. As the police unravel the pattern, they discover that the story of the missing children stretches back generations, and the one who started it all may still be walking among them. The streetlights along Ashwood Lane buzzed faintly, their halos of orange cutting through the thick, early morning mist. At 4:12 a.m., most of the neighborhood lay in stillness, rows of identical houses with trimmed hedges and neat driveways, a portrait of suburban quiet. But inside one of those homes, the silence was broken by a mother's scream. Hannah Whitlock stumbled barefoot across the hardwood floors of her daughter's room, her throat raw from calling her name. The pink blankets on the bed were pushed back as if Emily had risen in the night. Her stuffed rabbit, the one she never slept without, sat upright on the pillow, its black button eyes staring. The window was locked. The closet was empty. Emily, just 6 years old, was gone. Hannah's first thought was sleepwalking. Emily had never done it before, but what else could explain an empty bed? She bolted through the hallway, shouting her name. The sound echoed down the stairwell. She checked the kitchen, the bathroom, the garage. Nothing. By the time she burst onto the porch, her heart hammering in her ears, the mist had thickened, blanketing the cul-de-sac in eerie quiet. And that's when she saw it. Drawn in chalk on the driveway, right at the edge where the concrete met the sidewalk, was a figure. Not a stick figure exactly, more detailed, as though someone had crouched in the night and traced it with care. The body was long, the arms extended, fingers splayed. The head was large, misshapen, and the smile, crooked, jagged, stretched from ear to ear. Hannah froze. It hadn't been there when she put Emily to bed. She was certain of that. The scream that ripped from her lungs brought neighbors to their porches. Doors opened, porch lights flicked on, voices carried through the fog. Within 10 minutes, police cars were crawling down Ashwood Lane, their red and blue lights cutting through the mist, illuminating the chalk figure over and over again like some ghastly centerpiece. Detective Laura Kincaid arrived just before sunrise. She was still shaking off the grogginess of the call. Missing child. Chalk drawing. The dispatcher's voice had faltered as if unsure whether to label it a prank or a nightmare. She parked near the Whitlock house and surveyed the street. Rows of near-identical homes stretched in both directions, most of them two-story colonials painted in muted grays and blues. Manicured lawns. SUVs parked neatly in driveways. A quiet neighborhood, the kind where nothing was supposed to happen. But nothing was exactly what Laura didn't trust. Officer Bailey flagged her down, his expression pale under the flashing lights. "She's inside," he said. "Mother's hysterical. Kid's name is Emily Whitlock, age 6. Father's on a business trip out of state." Laura nodded. "The chalk." Bailey gestured to the driveway. The figure stared up at her, distorted, grinning. "Neighbors say they've never seen anything like it," Bailey said. "None of the kids on this street are old enough to draw something this creepy." Laura crouched by the figure. The chalk lines were fresh, untouched by dew, suggesting they'd been drawn sometime after midnight. She traced the air above them with her gloved hand. Whoever had drawn it had taken their time. The lines weren't the careless scribbles of a child. They were deliberate, precise. And that smile, it unnerved her. "Bag what's left of the chalk if you can find it," she said, rising, "and canvass the street. Somebody must have seen or heard something." Inside, the Whitlock house smelled of coffee and lavender cleaner. Hannah sat at the dining table, wrapped in a blanket, clutching Emily's stuffed rabbit so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes were swollen from crying. "She was right there," Hannah kept saying, pointing toward the upstairs. "I tucked her in. I checked the window. It was locked, I swear. How could she just vanish?" Laura spoke gently. Did Emily ever talk about sleepwalking? Bad dreams? Someone she might have seen outside? Hannah shook her head. No. She was happy. She loved school, loved her teacher. She was planning her birthday party. Hannah broke off, pressing the rabbit to her chest. Do you know anyone who might want to hurt your family? Anyone with a grudge? Another shake of the head. No one. We moved here 3 years ago for the quiet. For safety. Everyone here is nice. Normal. Laura let the word hang in her head as she glanced toward the front window. Outside, the chalk figure still grinned. By mid-morning, the search was in full swing. Officers combed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, interviewing neighbors, checking sheds and backyards. Volunteers gathered at the park, ready to fan out through nearby woods. K-9 units sniffed for Emily's scent. Laura walked the perimeter of the house again, studying every inch. No signs of forced entry. No footprints in the soft earth of the garden. No smudges on the window glass. Whoever had taken Emily hadn't broken in. They'd somehow lured her out. At the end of the cul-de-sac, Mrs. Jensen, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, waved Laura over. I heard something, she said, lowering her voice. Around 3 in the morning. A car. Slow. I looked out my window, and I swear I saw someone standing near the Whitlock's driveway. Could you see who it was? Mrs. Jensen pursed her lips. Tall. Thin. Just standing there. Watching the house. Man or woman? Man, I think. But I can't be sure. The fog was thick. Did you see Emily? No. Just the man. And then, look. I saw it after the police arrived. Same figure I remember from when I was a girl. Laura froze. What do you mean? Mrs. Jensen leaned closer. Years ago, must have been the 1970s, there were stories. Chalk figures showing up near houses when kids went missing. They never found who did it. But we all remembered the drawings. Always smiling. Always waiting. Laura's stomach tightened. And how many children went missing? Mrs. Jensen's eyes clouded. 3. Maybe 4. Depends on who you ask. They said the man lived here once, long ago, before the subdivision was built. But you won't find his name in the records. By noon, reporters swarmed Ashwood Lane, their cameras trained on the chalk figure. Headlines blared. Child missing, strange drawing found outside home. The town was buzzing, but the figure itself seemed to buzz louder, as though mocking everyone who stared at it. Laura returned to the station to review old files. If what Mrs. Jensen said was true, this wasn't the first time Ashwood Lane had seen chalk drawings tied to missing children. But the archives were a mess, misplaced reports, cases marked unsolved, gaps in records from decades ago. Still, she found one. A yellowed newspaper clipping from 1979. Local girl missing, chalk drawing found near home. The photo was grainy, but clear enough. A figure drawn in chalk on a sidewalk, its smile unnervingly similar to the one outside the Whitlock home. Laura leaned back in her chair. A cold shiver ran through her. Whoever had taken Emily hadn't just chosen her at random. This was a pattern. A cycle. And it had started long before Emily Whitlock was even born. That evening, Hannah Whitlock sat in Emily's room, rocking gently with the stuffed rabbit in her arms. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock. Outside, the mist rolled back in, thick and heavy. At 11:37 p.m., a sound broke the silence. A faint scratching, like chalk dragged across concrete. Hannah froze, her breath caught in her throat. She stood, trembling, and peered through the blinds. On the sidewalk below, in the glow of the streetlight, a shadow bent low to the ground, arm moving back and forth. Drawing. And when it stood, tall, thin, face lost in the mist, it turned toward the window. And smiled. The rain had finally stopped, but Ashwood Lane still smelled of damp leaves and something older, like wet stone mixed with dust from years gone by. Detective Sarah Holden parked her sedan at the mouth of the narrow street and stepped out, her shoes crunching against gravel slick with moisture. She looked around. Ashwood Lane wasn't a through road. It was a dead end, a forgotten corner of town with just 4 leaning houses and 1 boarded-up storefront. If you didn't know it was here, you wouldn't stumble across it. The city planners had rerouted traffic away from it decades ago, leaving the lane suspended in time like a fossil. But this was where the second chalk figure had been found. The call had come in the night before. A patrol officer, responding to a noise complaint, had found the chalk outline on the cracked pavement just outside an abandoned duplex. Not a stick figure this time. This one was larger, more elaborate. A man's body, arms outstretched, legs bent unnaturally. Sarah stood now where the officer had described. The outline had already smudged from rain, but she could still see the ghostly impression of it. A chalk figure splayed like a puppet whose strings had been cut. And at its feet, written in tight block letters, was a single word, Ash. The neighbors. Across the street, an old woman leaned out from a sagging porch, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes followed Sarah with the wary, guarded look of someone who had lived too long on the edge of forgotten places. "Detective," Sarah called gently, stepping closer. "Did you see who drew it?" The woman shook her head slowly. "I don't sleep much. I sit here most nights, but I didn't hear no chalk. Didn't see no one. Just woke up and it was there." Sarah studied her. The woman's gray hair was tied in a knot, her face lined deep. She seemed honest, but Sarah had learned to read people like storm clouds. Some were harmless, some had thunder hidden inside. "What's your name?" Sarah asked. "Mrs. Decker." "Have you lived here long?" "All my life. Longer than most. Ashwood's got a way of keeping people, detective, or chasing them off." That last sentence hung heavy, the way locals sometimes talk about places as if they're alive. Mrs. Decker's eyes flicked toward the faded chalk. "It's him, isn't it? The same one who drew the first." Sarah didn't answer, but the silence was enough. The first victim's ghost. The first chalk figure had been found downtown, outside a bar called the Rusted Nail. At first glance, people thought it was a drunk's prank, a stick figure sprawled on the sidewalk. But the details were too precise. The figure's proportions matched an actual body, its limbs bent in a way that suggested a real fall, a real collapse. Hours later, they found the body of Matthew Riley, age 28, in a vacant lot 2 blocks away. And his body matched the chalk figure perfectly, pose for pose. That was a week ago. And now, another figure. Another outline. Another taunt. Following the lane. Sarah walked the length of Ashwood Lane, letting her eyes trace the cracks in the pavement, the broken windows, the sagging porches. Every corner felt like it carried whispers, like the street itself wanted to speak. At the very end of the lane stood the duplex. Its windows were boarded, but one of the boards had been pried loose. The paint on the door was long gone, stripped down to gray wood. Someone had carved symbols into the surface, shapes Sarah didn't immediately recognize. She leaned closer. They weren't gang tags. They looked older, almost ritualistic. Circles intersected with triangles, jagged marks scratched deep. Sarah pulled a glove from her pocket and traced one shallow groove. The wood flaked under her touch. "Detective Holden?" She turned. Officer Briggs, one of the patrolmen, was standing at the mouth of the lane, holding a plastic evidence bag. Inside it was a scrap of paper, wet but legible. "We found this about 20 feet from the chalk outline." Sarah took it. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, but clear. "The next name will be written here." Her throat tightened. This wasn't random graffiti. It was a promise. The teenagers. Later that afternoon, Sarah found 2 teenagers lingering near the entrance of the lane. They were skittish, their hoodies pulled tight, cigarettes dangling. She flashed her badge and they froze. "You boys see anything last night?" she asked. One shrugged. We just hang out sometimes. Place is creepy." The other smirked nervously. "We call it Chalk Street now." Ever since, his voice trailed off, but Sarah knew what he meant. The first body had become gossip, urban legend fodder. She leaned in slightly. "Did you see who drew it? Even a shadow? A figure?" The smirk dropped. The boy glanced at his friend, then back at Sarah. "We saw someone. Just a shape moving fast. But up, kinda hunched. Like he didn't want to be seen." "What time?" "Past midnight. We didn't stick around. Didn't want to get chalked next." Sarah's chest tightened. The fear in his voice was real. The ledger of names. That evening, Sarah sat at her desk, files spread around her. Riley's autopsy report. The crime scene photos. And now, the new chalk outline from Ashwood Lane. She connected the dots with red pen. The first figure had matched Riley. But who would this second one represent? She kept coming back to the word scrawled in chalk. Ash. Was it just a reference to Ashwood Lane? Or was it a name? A clue? She ran searches through the database. Ashley, Ashford, Ashton. A dozen names came up, but none tied neatly to Riley. Then she found it, Ashford Logistics. A shipping company that once operated out of the abandoned storefront on Ashwood Lane. Shut down years ago after allegations of smuggling and workplace accidents. The name Ashford had been buried in dusty records, but here it was, written on the ground in chalk. Sarah leaned back, her mind racing. Whoever was drawing these figures, they weren't just playing a game. They were digging up old bones. The Watcher. As dusk fell, Sarah drove back to Ashwood Lane. The street was quiet, soaked in twilight. She stood where the chalk figure had been and looked around. Something shifted at the edge of her vision. A curtain moved in one of the boarded houses. Sarah's pulse quickened. She stepped closer, gravel crunching underfoot. The curtain shifted again, just a fraction. Someone was inside. Watching. Police, she called firmly. Come out. No answer. She stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning beneath her weight. She reached for the door, but it was locked from within. She leaned against it, listening. For a moment, she swore she heard breathing. Then silence. Sarah stepped back, eyes scanning the windows. Whoever was inside didn't want to be seen. But they were there. And they had been watching. The note in the rafters. The following morning, a construction crew working near the lane called in a discovery. In the rafters of the old duplex, they had found another scrap of paper wedged between beams. Sarah arrived quickly, gloves on, evidence bag ready. She unfolded the paper carefully. This one was different, handwriting steadier, deliberate. Ashwood remembers. The names are written. The chalk will not fade. Her stomach turned. This wasn't just about Riley. This wasn't random. Whoever was behind the chalk figures had a list, and Ashwood Lane was only the beginning. Sarah stood in the center of the lane, the paper trembling in her hand, the damp air clinging to her skin. The street was too quiet, too still, as if holding its breath. And Sarah knew this was no ordinary case. Ashwood Lane wasn't just a crime scene. It was a stage. And the killer had only just begun the performance. Detective Sarah Holden stared at the scrap of paper in her gloved hands, the one pulled from the rafters of the duplex. Ashwood remembers. The names are written. The chalk will not fade. It wasn't just taunting anymore. It was doctrine. Whoever was behind this wasn't simply marking victims. They were recording them, memorializing them in chalk, as though the figures themselves were scripture. But whose names? Sarah had been turning that question over for hours, running through police records, old property deeds, and every archived report she could find tied to Ashwood Lane. Some names appeared repeatedly: Ashford, Decker, Halloway. But nothing explained the connection to Matthew Riley, the first victim. Until one document stopped her cold. It was a faded copy of a missing persons ledger from 1999. Inside was a list of names, all tied to Ashwood Lane. A dozen men and women had vanished in the space of 2 years. No suspects. No bodies. The file had been buried, officially labeled unresolved, cold. And at the bottom of the ledger, one name had been scratched out so violently the paper had nearly torn. Elias Halloway, the record keeper. The next morning, Sarah drove to the municipal records office downtown. The building smelled of mildew and ink, the kind of place where old secrets linger. She asked for Halloway's file. The clerk, a man with pale skin and a tired face, raised his eyebrows. That name hasn't come up in years. You sure you want to dig there? Sarah flashed her badge. I don't have the luxury of ignoring it. The clerk disappeared into the back and returned with a slim, dust-coated folder. Inside were only 2 documents: a lease agreement for a house on Ashwood Lane and a coroner's certificate of probable death. No body had ever been found. probable death? Sarah asked aloud. The clerk shrugged. When they never turn up after 7 years, that's what the system stamps. But between you and me, he leaned closer, Holloway was no ordinary disappearance. People said he was into things. Things that don't belong in daylight. Sarah pressed. A cult. The clerk didn't answer, but his silence was enough. Ashwood's passed. Later that afternoon, Sarah returned to Ashwood Lane. The rain had begun again, a light drizzle that darkened the pavement where the chalk figure had once been. She stood beneath the porch of the duplex, flipping through Holloway's lease papers. The house listed was the very same structure where the paper had been found in the rafters. Elias Holloway had lived here. She turned, eyes sweeping the windows. A cold thought slid through her. What if Holloway had never really left? A shadow flickered across a far window. Sarah froze. She wasn't alone. The forgotten witness. Sarah stepped into the nearest house, the one where she had seen the curtain move the night before. The front door gave under her push, the hinges shrieking. Dust and stale air rushed out. Inside, the house smelled of rot and mothballs. Furniture was draped in yellowed sheets, cobwebs stretched like lace in the corners. And in the living room, huddled in an armchair, was a man. He was thin, almost skeletal, with a beard that reached his chest and eyes that gleamed too bright against sunken sockets. He blinked at Sarah as though pulling himself out of another world. "Elias Holloway?" she asked. The man chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. No, Elias is gone. But I remember him." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" "They call me the Keeper. Because I remember the names. The names everyone else forgot." Her skin prickled. The names inside. The man pulled a small notebook from under his chair, its cover cracked and flaking. He opened it with trembling fingers, and Sarah glimpsed pages upon pages of handwritten names. Some she recognized: Matthew Riley, Ashford, Decker. Others were strangers, their fates unknown. "They tried to erase us," the man whispered. "Erase the ledger. But Elias, he wouldn't let go. He said Ashwood remembers. That's why the chalk comes back. Always the chalk." Sarah leaned closer, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Who is drawing the figures now?" The man's eyes went glassy. "A child of Ashwood. One who carries the burden. The forgotten name." Sarah pressed. Whose name was scratched out in the ledger? The keeper's hands shook as he clutched the book. Elias's. They wanted him gone. But he's still here, detective. Still writing. The hollow room. Sarah left the house unsettled, the keeper's words rattling in her skull. If Elias Holloway had been erased, why did his presence still linger? She returned to the duplex, this time prying loose one of the boards on the side window. She slipped inside. The air was damp, carrying the musk of mildew and ash. Floorboards sagged beneath her steps. In the kitchen, she found something strange: dozens of faint chalk marks on the linoleum. Not figures, just tally marks. Hundreds of them, scratched in crooked lines, as though someone had been counting days. Upstairs, the walls were lined with writing. Words scrawled in chalk, repeated endlessly, names. Mims. And at the end of the hallway, a locked door. Sarah pushed against it, but it didn't budge. She crouched, shining her flashlight at the gap beneath. Her blood ran cold. Written in chalk, in tiny cramped letters that trailed out from the other side, was a single phrase repeated over and over. The forgotten name. A warning in the dark. As Sarah exited the duplex, rain pounding harder now, she noticed a shape standing at the far end of Ashwood Lane. A figure in a hooded jacket, motionless, half hidden in the mist. Her hand went to her gun. "Police! Stay where you are!" The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. Then, in one slow motion, they bent down and drew something on the wet pavement. Chalk scraped against stone, audible even through the rain. Sarah sprinted forward, but by the time she reached the spot, the figure was gone. Vanished into the maze of side alleys. She looked down. Another chalk outline. This one crude but unmistakable. It was of a woman, and scrawled beside it, in rushed letters, was her own name. Sarah. The forgotten name revealed. Sarah's chest tightened as she staggered back, staring at her name in chalk. This wasn't random anymore. It wasn't just about Riley, or Ashwood, or even Halloway. She was part of it now. The keeper's words echoed in her head, a child of Ashwood. One who carries the burden. The forgotten name. She thought of Halloway, the name scratched out in the old ledger. Erased. Forgotten. But if he was still alive, or if someone was carrying on his work, then maybe she wasn't the first detective to tread these steps. Maybe someone had once tried before her and paid the price. The chalk wasn't just marking victims. It was binding the living to the dead. And now, Sarah's name had been written. Her time was running out. The rain had not stopped all night. Ashwood Lane lay drenched under a curtain of water, the chalk outline of Sarah's name already half-smudged, but still legible enough to make her stomach twist each time she replayed the image in her mind. Sleep hadn't come. When she finally closed her eyes, she dreamed of faceless figures crouched over sidewalks, their hands smearing white lines into endless silhouettes. When she woke, she was drenched in sweat, her phone buzzing with an early morning call. It was Captain Reeves. "You'd better get down here," he said grimly. "We've got another one." The widow's house. The address led Sarah to a small clapboard house on the edge of Ashwood's marshland. A police cruiser blocked the gravel driveway, its red and blue lights cutting through the mist. A cluster of neighbors stood in the rain, whispering. Sarah caught fragments as she passed. "It's her again. Should have left years ago." The widow cursed. Inside, the smell of mildew and damp fabric hit her. The body lay in the living room. A woman, pale, her hair splayed across the floor like seaweed. Her lips were tinged blue, but there was no blood, no wound. Just her body inside a chalk outline drawn not by police, but by the killer. On the wall above her, written in smudged strokes. The chalk widow. Sarah crouched by the body. The woman had been older, late 60s maybe. Her hands were folded neatly across her stomach, like she'd been prepared for burial. "Who found her?" Sarah asked. Officer Grant gestured to the hall. "Neighbor. Says she was known as Mrs. Alden. Lived alone for years. Husband disappeared in the 90s. Sarah's pulse quickened. "In the 90s? Grant nodded. No body ever found. People whispered he ran off. Or that she did something to him." Sarah's mind snapped back to the ledger she'd seen, the list of missing persons tied to Ashwood in the late 90s. Alden had been one of the names. The ledger's threads. Back at the precinct, Sarah dug out the cold case binder again. She found the entry, John Alden, last seen 1997. Residence, Ashwood Lane. Status, missing, presumed dead. Now his widow had been marked. It was a pattern, Sarah realized. The chalk figures weren't random. They were a continuation of unfinished business, decades old. Every victim tied back to the missing persons from the ledger. The killer wasn't just murdering, they were binding the past to the present. The scratched-out name, Elias Halloway, kept flashing in her mind. Why erase him? Unless Halloway wasn't meant to be a victim, but something else. A witness. Or worse, a founder. She thought again of the strange man she had met, the keeper. He had spoken of Elias with reverence, as though the missing man hadn't been erased at all but transformed into myth. And now another thread in the ledger had been pulled. The widow of a vanished man, killed with ceremony. The widow's secrets. That night, Sarah returned to Mrs. Alden's house. The crime scene tape fluttered against the porch, snapping in the wind. Inside, the house felt wrong. Too still. She moved room by room, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. In the bedroom, she found a trunk at the foot of the bed. Its lock was rusted, but a firm kick broke it open. Inside were letters. Dozens, tied in faded ribbon. Sarah untied one bundle and began to read. "Dearest Ruth," the letter began, "I see them at night. They gather in the lane. Chalk in their hands. Elias says it is the only way to remember, the only way to keep the silence at bay. But I am afraid. Afraid that one day it will not be enough." Sarah's chest tightened. John Alden had written this. Not only had he known Elias Halloway, he had been part of whatever ritual haunted Ashwood Lane. The next letter was even darker. Elias calls it the Pact of Ashwood. We bind the forgotten with chalk so their voices cannot rise. But what if one day the chalk fails? What if the forgotten return? Sarah dropped the letter, her hands trembling. This wasn't random violence. This was legacy. The keeper returns. She left the house and found the keeper waiting for her outside, leaning against the fence like he had known she would come. His long beard was wet with rain, his eyes glassy in the dim light. "You've seen her," he rasped. "The chalk widow." Sarah's hand hovered near her weapon. "You knew she would be next." The keeper smiled faintly. "We all knew. The ledger remembers, even when men forget." Sarah stepped closer. "Tell me about the pact." The keeper's smile faltered. "A foolish bargain. Holloway thought he could contain them. The voices, the ones that rise in the night. Chalk was the answer, he said. Mark the lost, keep them bound. But every pact has a price, detective." Sarah's skin crawled. "What price?" The keeper's voice dropped to a whisper. "The widows. The wives left behind. They were the first sacrifice. The woman in black." Later that week, Sarah was called again to Ashwood Lane. Another witness sighting. This time, it wasn't chalk. It was a woman. Multiple neighbors reported seeing a figure dressed in black lace, wandering the marshes at night. Some called her the widow of Fairmere Marsh. Others swore she was Ruth Alden herself, risen from her chalk outline, searching for her missing husband. Sarah walked the edge of the marsh under a pale moon, her boots sinking into mud. The air smelled of wet earth and decay. And then she saw her. A figure in black, veil covering her face, standing knee-deep in the reeds. "Ruth Alden?" Sarah called. The woman turned, but the veil revealed nothing but shadow. She lifted her hand. Chalk dust spilled from her fingers like sand through an hourglass. Sarah's flashlight flickered, then died. When it came back on, the woman was gone. Only a fresh outline remained on the path. Not of a stranger. Of Sarah herself. The forgotten name tightens. Back in her car, Sarah tried to steady her breathing. The chalk was no longer following the ledger, it was anticipating her. She pulled out her phone, scrolling back to the photos she had taken of the old case files. Every missing person. Every widow. Every name. Except one. Elias Holloway. The name erased from the ledger. The forgotten one. And in that moment, Sarah realized the truth she had been circling since the beginning. The chalk wasn't about remembering at all. It was about erasure. And whoever the chalk widow was, whether a ghost, a mimic, or a woman left hollowed by grief, she wasn't hunting victims. She was hunting those who tried to forget. And now Sarah's name had been written among them. The widow's bargain. The chapter closed on a stormy night, Sarah alone at her desk, letters spread before her, trying to trace the line between past and present. At the bottom of the last letter, in a trembling hand, John Alden had written a warning to his wife. "If the chalk returns, run. Do not look back. Do not answer when they call your name. The forgotten one always collects his debt." Sarah folded the letter, her mind racing. The chalk widow wasn't a victim. She was a messenger. And the message was clear. The debt was coming due. The air in Ashwood carried a strange heaviness that evening, the kind that pressed into skin and seemed to lodge in bone. Detective Clara Hensley stood just beyond the rotted gate of the McVeigh property, staring at the chalk figure left earlier that morning. It had rained briefly in the afternoon, but the outline remained sharp, untouched by weather, as if the rain had recoiled from it. The figure wasn't merely a human outline. This one was different. Its arms were stretched above its head, bent unnaturally, and across its torso was a series of chalk marks resembling tally lines. 4 of them, etched in white dust. Clara crouched low, studying them with her gloved hand hovering but never touching. 4 victims, murmured Officer Dale, her partner. His voice was low, uncertain, as though speaking too loudly might invite something into the world. Clara didn't answer at once. She traced the line of her eyes down to where the figure's chalk feet pointed, toward the tree-line, toward the depths of Ashwood itself. "The chalk is communicating with us," Clara said finally. "This isn't just a warning anymore. It's a record. And a direction." The town meeting. That night, The people of Ashwood gathered in the basement of the small community church, its old stone walls sweating dampness, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Clara hadn't wanted to call the meeting, but the mayor insisted after the fourth chalk figure appeared. The basement was full of anxious faces, farmers, shopkeepers, mothers clutching children's hands. The town hadn't felt this united in decades, though the unity wasn't born of comfort but of fear. Mayor Ridley, sweating in his ill-fitting suit, stood at the front, fumbling with a notepad. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I know tensions are high, but the Ashwood police are working closely with Detective Hensley here and—" "Working closely?" shouted a man from the back, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Another one's dead. Another chalk shadow. You can't even keep count without the killer leaving notes on the ground." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara stepped forward, her presence firm, her voice steady. "Whoever's behind this wants us to panic. That's the power of fear. It drives us apart. I need you to stay vigilant, but I also need your honesty. Any strange events, sightings, stories you've heard, now's the time to bring them forward." The silence was thick, broken only by the faint creak of a pew shifting upstairs. Then, an old woman in a dark shawl spoke. Her voice was cracked, ancient. "It's happening again." Every head turned toward her. Claire approached. "What's happening again?" The woman's eyes glistened with memory. "The pact. The story of the pact." The woman's name was Agnes Merriweather, one of the last remaining descendants of Ashwood's founding families. She sat stiffly in her folding chair, hands clasped around a rosary that shook with each breath. "Back when this town was little more than a dozen houses," Agnes began, "the marsh swallowed 3 children in one season. Drowned without reason. No storms, no accidents. Just gone. Their bodies rose days later, marked with symbols carved into their skin. That's when the elders made the pact." Her words hushed the room further. "They went into the woods, carrying chalk and candles. They said they struck a bargain with the shadows that haunt Ashwood, offering something in exchange for safety. Every generation since, when the signs come back, we know the pact is weakening. The figures return. The tally begins again." "Who made this pact?" Clara pressed, her investigator's mind clinging to specifics. Agnes's eyes darted to the mayor, then back to Clara. "Our leaders. The ones who thought they could buy peace with promises. But the shadows never leave. They only wait." Someone muttered, "Superstitious nonsense." But Clara noticed something. The mayor wasn't scoffing. He was staring down at his hands, avoiding her gaze. A hidden ledger. After the meeting, Clara cornered Mayor Ridley outside, under the dim yellow light of the church's lantern. "You knew what she was talking about," Clara said flatly. The mayor's jaw worked nervously. "Detective, it's just folklore. Every town's got its ghost stories." "Then why wouldn't you look me in the eye when she said, 'leaders'?" Ridley rubbed the back of his neck, beads of sweat clinging to his thinning hairline. Finally, he leaned closer. "My grandfather kept a ledger. It's in my house. Has records of town meetings from over a century ago. He always warned me, if the chalk returned, the ledger would matter again." Clara's pulse quickened. "Take me to it." The ledger was locked inside an oak chest in the mayor's study, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Ridley unwrapped it with trembling hands, the brittle leather cover flaking as it opened. The entries were written in sharp cursive ink, each line describing disputes, land divisions, and community business. But near the end, Clara found the entry she needed. October 3, 1891. A pact made beneath the ash trees. For names written. For promises given. In exchange, the marsh and woods shall claim no more. The names listed were of Ashwood's founding families. And next to each was a symbol, a shape, crude but unmistakable. Chalk figures. Clara traced them with her finger. Her mind reeled. The chalk wasn't random. It was genealogical. It was coming after bloodlines. The genealogy of fear. The next morning, Clara sat in the station poring over census records, tracing the surviving descendants of those 4 families. The McVeys, the Hollises, the Merriweathers, the Ridleys. Her heart sank. The victims so far, 2 McVeys, 1 Hollis, one distant Ridley cousin. The tally lines matched. The chalk wasn't just recording death, it was fulfilling the pact. If that was true, Agnes Merriweather, old and frail, was the last of her family. And she was next. The attempted protection. Clara insisted on posting 2 officers outside Agnes's home that night. The old widow lived in a creaking cottage on Ashwood Lane, its shutters hanging loose, its chimney long since cold. "I've lived too long to be frightened by shadows," Agnes told Clara, though her hands trembled as she gripped her rosary. "We're not taking chances," Clara replied. "If this is bloodline-driven, you're a target." The night stretched long. Midnight passed, and the marsh fog rolled in thick and silent. The officers patrolled, flashlights cutting through mist. At 2:14 a.m., the power cut. The entire street sank into darkness. The officers rushed inside to check on Agnes. Clara, already awake, burst into the parlor, only to find a chalk outline spread across the living room floor, glowing faintly in the moonlight. But Agnes was still alive, sitting rigid in her chair, eyes wide with horror. The outline had been drawn beneath her, as if preparing for her body before death even came. "Dear God," Dale whispered from the doorway. Agnes's lips moved soundlessly, whispering a prayer. Clara knelt beside her. "They've marked me," Agnes said, "but not yet taken me. That means they want something more." Clara stared at the glowing chalk, at the tally marks that had shifted again. 5 now. 1 more than the families accounted for. That meant the pact had evolved, or been corrupted. The chalk was no longer bound to the old bloodlines. It was choosing, expanding. The terror in Ashwood was no longer history repeating itself. It was history rewriting its own rules. Clara rose to her feet, resolve hardening in her chest. "The chalk isn't just keeping a pact," she said aloud. "It's enforcing it. And if we don't find out what that pact demanded, it won't stop. It'll claim everyone it wants." Agnes gripped her hand tightly. Her eyes, clouded with age, gleamed with finality. "Then you must go where it began," she whispered. "Back to the trees where they wrote their names. Back to the ash grove. That's where the shadows keep their bargain." Clara nodded slowly, though the weight of the task pressed on her chest. The pact of Ashwood was not broken. It was very much alive. And it was waiting for her. The morning mist hung over Ashwood like a veil, muting the colors of the world until everything looked like shades of gray chalk. Detective Clara Hensley stood at the edge of the marshland, staring into the tangle of trees that marked the grove. This was where it began, the so-called heart of the pact. Her boots sank slightly in the damp soil as she stepped forward. Officer Dale was behind her, flashlight in hand though the day was bright. "You really think the answer's out here?" he asked. Clara didn't look back. "If we don't find what they bargained with, Dale, we'll never stop this. The chalk is holding up its end of the deal. We just don't know what the payment was," Dale muttered, "or who it was promised to." The path twisted deeper, lined with black ash trees whose bark peeled like old skin. Each trunk seemed scarred by strange, unnatural gouges, marks too deliberate to be the work of animals. They resembled crude symbols, echoes of the same figures Clara had traced in the ledger. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals. Just the sound of their breathing and the occasional squelch of mud underfoot. Clara felt her heartbeat slow into a tense rhythm, her body acutely aware of being watched. The clearing. After nearly an hour, the trees thinned, opening into a clearing. At its center stood a circle of stones, moss-covered but unmistakably arranged by human hands. Clara felt the temperature drop the moment she entered the circle. "This is it," she whispered. The stones were old, older than Ashwood itself. Some bore shallow carvings, lines, X marks, and half-formed figures that matched the chalk silhouettes they had been finding in town. In the center of the circle lay a depression in the earth, as though a fire had been built there long ago. The soil within it was black, but it hadn't been burned in decades. Dale crouched near one of the stones. "Detective, you need to see this." Carved into the surface was a name, shallow but clear despite the erosion of time. McVeigh. Clara ran her gloved hand across it. Then, moving clockwise, she found another Hollis. Next, Ridley. Finally, Merriweather. The founding families. It's a contract, Clara said, her voice taut. A pact literally written into stone. The whisper in the grove. A sudden gust of wind pushed through the clearing, though the treetops outside stood still. The hair on Clara's neck prickled. She turned sharply, certain she'd heard something. A whisper, low and indistinct. Dale stiffened. "You heard that too?" he asked. Clara nodded, scanning the shadows between the trees. "Keep your light steady." The whisper grew, threading through the air like a chant. Not loud, not sharp, but constant, like breath pressed through stone. The words were in no language Clara recognized, yet they carried a weight that pressed into her skull, vibrating against bone. She stepped into the center of the circle. "What do you want from us?" she demanded. The whisper faltered, then shifted, rising into something more distinct. The words formed just enough to register. "Payment due." The stone ledger. Dale swore under his breath, his flashlight beam shaking across the stones. Clara knelt near the fire pit and brushed away the soil. Her hand struck something hard. It was a flat slab, buried shallowly, inscribed with dozens of names. She dug furiously until it emerged, an ancient stone ledger. The first entries were the same as the ledger in the mayor's study, the 4 families. But underneath, new names had been etched over the years. Each generation, more names added, scratched into the stone with crude precision. And beside many of them, a faint chalk mark lingered, as if the grooves had held the powder over centuries. Dale leaned in. "It's a list. Of sacrifices." Clara's stomach dropped. "Not sacrifices. Payments." Her finger traced down the names. The McVeys. The Hollises. The Ridleys. The Merriweathers. Generations fed to the pact. But near the bottom of the slab, a new name had been added much more recently, the etching still sharp and unweathered. Hensley. Clara froze. Dale's eyes widened. "That's your family." Her throat tightened. She wasn't a descendant of Ashwood's founders. Her family had only moved here 2 generations ago. But someone had carved her name anyway. The pact had expanded beyond the original bargain. The whisper returned, louder this time, pressing against her eardrums. "Payment due. One more. One more." The vision. Clara staggered back from the slab, her vision swimming. For a moment, the grove blurred, and she saw figures standing at the edges of the circle. Dozens of them, tall, faceless, made entirely of shadow. Their bodies swayed like reeds, their heads tilting in unison. Each held a stick of chalk in one elongated hand. When they lifted the chalk, the world itself seemed to dim. They began drawing on the earth, figures spreading outward from the circle, outlines that linked together like a chain of bodies stretching into infinity. Clara blinked hard, and the vision vanished. But her chest still heaved as if she'd run for miles. "They don't just want the families," she whispered. "They want everyone." A desperate return. Back at the station, Clara laid out what she'd seen and the stone ledger she and Dale had photographed. The room was thick with disbelief, but no one argued. The officers had seen enough. The chalk figures, the glowing outlines, the impossible coincidences. The mayor looked gray as ash. If the packs widened, we're all targets. The entire town. Agnes Merriweather, frail but fierce, had been brought in for her protection. She leaned heavily on her cane, eyes sharp despite her years. "The grove won't let go until it's fed what it's owed. The elders bound us all to it. You can't reason with shadows." Clara clenched her fists. "Maybe we can't reason with them. But every pact has terms. If it's demanding payment, then it must have rules. I need to know what those rules are." Agnes shook her head. "Rules written by things that are not human don't favor us." "Maybe not," Clara said. "But if they wrote names into stone, if they kept records, it means they're bound to the ledger too. That's their weakness." The 5th mark. That night, just as Clara feared, another chalk figure appeared, this time on the steps of the police station itself. The outline was longer, distorted, the head bent unnaturally backward. Across its chest, 5 tally marks. The chalk had come for them directly. Dale stared at it with horror. "It's not waiting anymore." It's hunting. Clara's eyes stayed locked on the figure. No. It's warning us. 5 victims, 5 payments. But there's something else. Every tally matches someone tied to the stone ledger. If we can find out who the 5th name belongs to, maybe we can predict the next target. But her voice wavered. Deep down, she already suspected. The 5th mark wasn't random. It was her. By midnight, Clara knew what she had to do. She gathered a lantern, a stick of chalk from evidence, and the photographs of the stone ledger. Dale tried to stop her. You walk back into that grove, they'll take you. That's what they want. Clara set her jaw. Then I'll give them something else. Something they don't expect. Agnes insisted on coming too, claiming the grove was part of her family's curse. Against Clara's better judgment, she agreed. The 3 of them returned to the ash grove. The clearing was waiting, alive with whispers. This time, the stone ledger pulsed faintly, as though light seeped from the names. Clara stepped into the circle. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. You want payment? Then deal with me directly. I know the pact. I know the rules. And I know you're bound by them as much as we are. The whisper surged into a roar, words layered over words until the air shook. One more. One more. Clara raised the chalk. Then I'll write the name myself. The pact reforged. She knelt before the slab, staring at the sharp letters of her surname. Slowly, deliberately, she drew a thick white line through it. The chalk snapped in her hand. The grove erupted. The shadows writhed, their forms distorting in fury. Agnes screamed a prayer. Dale raised his gun, though it seemed laughably useless. Clara shouted over the noise. No more payments. This pact is broken. The whispers twisted into something else, a howl of rage. The ground trembled. The names on the slab glowed bright, searing into her vision. For a terrible moment, Clara thought the shadows would strike, that they'd tear her apart where she knelt. Then, silence. The whispers cut off. The shadows dissolved into smoke, fading into the trees. The light from the ledger dimmed until it was just a dead stone again. Clara dropped the broken chalk. Her chest heaved. Agnes collapsed to her knees, tears streaking her face. You've undone what bound us. Clara wasn't sure. She stared at the slab, at the faint smear where her name had been crossed. For now, the grove was still. But in the quiet, she couldn't shake the feeling that breaking the pact hadn't ended it. It had only changed the rules. The following morning, the town woke to silence, not the peaceful kind, but a silence that pressed down heavy, the kind that made dogs whimper and children cling tighter to their parents. Detective Clara Hensley hadn't slept. She sat in the station's break room, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold. On the table in front of her lay the photographs of the stone ledger, the broken stick of chalk, and her own handwritten notes. She had crossed her name out. She had defied the pact. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't ended anything at all. Dale entered, his uniform rumpled, his face pale. He held something wrapped in a plastic evidence bag. He didn't say anything at first, just set it on the table between them. Clara leaned forward. It was another chalk figure. This one had been drawn overnight, in the middle of Main Street, perfectly centered between the bank and the bakery. The shape was tall, but crooked. Across its chest, 6 tally marks. Clara's stomach dropped. 6. Dale nodded grimly. It's counting again. The 6th name. Clara spread out the photos of the ledger. 5 names had already matched to the victims they knew. Now there was a 6th tally. Someone else is marked, she said quietly. Dale rubbed a hand across his tired eyes. Then who? Because if it's not you anymore, who the hell does it want? Before Clara could answer, a knock sounded at the station door. Agnes Merriweather stood there, cane in hand, her eyes sharper than either of theirs despite her age. You should know better than to think you've escaped, she said without preamble. The chalk doesn't forgive. If your name was on that slab, detective, then so is your bloodline. Maybe you can cross your name off once, but you can't erase what's carved in stone. Clara clenched her jaw. Then it's not me. It's someone connected to me. Dale frowned. You don't have kids. Who else could it be? The realization landed heavy in Clara's chest. My brother. family ties. Clara hadn't spoken to her brother, Evan Hensley, in nearly 3 years. He had stayed behind in Ashwood after their parents died, working odd jobs, drinking too much, and avoiding responsibility the way he always had. She remembered the last conversation they'd had, a bitter fight over selling the family home. She had left him in that house on Birch Lane with his stubborn pride and his debts. If the chalk wanted someone with her name, Evan was the next in line. Clara shoved back from the table. We need to get to him before the chalk does. The house on Birch Lane. The Hensley house looked smaller than Clara remembered, though maybe that was just because the roof sagged and the paint peeled. The porch boards groaned under her boots as she climbed the steps. She knocked once, then again harder. Evan! It's Clara. Open up. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then the door creaked, and there he was, unshaven, bloodshot eyes, a bottle of whiskey in one hand though it was barely past noon. Well, he slurred. The prodigal sister returns. Clara didn't waste time. She pushed past him into the dim living room. You're in danger. We have to go. Evan scoffed. In danger from what? Your cop stories? Please. She turned sharply, her voice like iron. This isn't a game, Evan. People are dead. And you're next. The figure in the yard, Dale, who had followed her, froze at the window. Detective, he whispered. Clara joined him. Outside, in the patchy grass of the front yard, a new chalk figure stretched across the dirt, fresh, stark white against the soil. It hadn't been there minutes ago. And it wasn't empty. Inside the outline lay a single item, Evan's work boots. Evan's face drained of color. The whiskey bottle slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. What the hell is this? Clara grabbed his arm. Proof. We're leaving. Now. The safe house. They brought Evan back to the station, locking him in one of the holding rooms for his own protection. He paced like a caged animal, muttering under his breath. Clara watched through the glass, her heart twisted. He looked so much like their father, same slope of the shoulders, same restless energy. And if she didn't figure out the rules of the pact soon, he would end up like the others, reduced to an outline of chalk. Agnes sat in the corner, her cane resting against the wall. It's already chosen him. You can't change that. Clara turned sharply. I crossed my name out. I broke their hold. Agnes shook her head. You delayed it. That's all. But once the chalk writes you in, there's no erasing it. Clara slammed her fist against the glass. There has to be a way. The sixth figure returns. That night, as Clara kept vigil at the station, the air grew heavy again. A faint scratching sound echoed through the halls, like chalk dragged slowly over slate. She followed it, gun drawn, until she reached the back corridor. On the wall, stretching from floor to ceiling, was a new figure. This one wasn't on the ground like the others. It stood upright as though it wanted to look her in the eye. Its head was tilted unnaturally far, its arms long, its chest marked with 6 tallies. And at the bottom of the figure, scrawled in jagged chalk letters, was one word. Evan. Clara's breath caught. She stumbled back, but the figure remained, unmoving yet oppressive, as though it were watching. From the holding room, Evan screamed. Clara sprinted, Dale right behind her. They burst into the holding room to find Evan on the floor, clawing at his throat as if invisible hands were tightening around it. His eyes bulged, his face purpled. Clara dropped to her knees. Evan, look at me. Dale grabbed at the air, swinging uselessly at nothing. The pressure in the room was suffocating, like the air had been pulled from their lungs. In desperation, Clara snatched the chalk stub she still carried and slammed it against the floor. She drew a circle around her brother as fast as she could, lines frantic and uneven. The moment the circle closed, Evan gasped, air rushing back into his lungs. He collapsed, trembling but alive. The whispers hissed in fury, retreating into silence. Dale wiped sweat from his brow. What the hell did you just do? Clara stared at the chalk circle, her hand shaking. I don't know, but I just rewrote the rules. A town in fear. Word spread fast. By morning, everyone in Ashwood had heard. The chalk had written a living name. Some townspeople packed and fled, their cars loaded with whatever they could carry. Others gathered at the church, praying, candles trembling in nervous hands. Mayor Ridley demanded answers Clara didn't have. "You said you stopped it. Now it's stronger than ever. How do we fight something we can't even touch?" Clara didn't answer him. Instead, she studied the chalk circle still protecting Evan in the holding room. She knew she couldn't keep him locked away forever. But she also knew the chalk had shifted its game. It wasn't just about marking victims anymore. It wanted them alive first. It wanted to draw them in closer before it claimed them. The ledger burns. Late that night, Clara returned to her desk. The photographs of the stone ledger stared back at her. Generations of names, carved into permanence. She made a decision. She and Dale drove to the grove under cover of darkness. The stone slab sat waiting in the circle. Clara poured gasoline across it, her hands trembling. "Are you sure about this?" Dale asked. Clara struck a match. "If the ledger's their contract, then maybe fire will void it." She dropped the flame. The slab ignited, the carvings glowing like molten iron. For a moment, the grove howled, whispers rising into shrieks, shadows writhing at the edge of the trees. Then the fire roared higher, and the ledger cracked down the middle, splitting in two. The glow sputtered out. The grove went still. Clara stood over the broken stone, chest heaving. "It's over." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure. The sixth figure's smile. When they returned to the station, Clara checked on Evan. He was asleep inside the chalk circle, his breathing steady. Relief washed over her, until she looked at the far wall. A new figure had appeared, scrawled in chalk. But this one was different. Its head wasn't tilted. Its arms weren't distorted. Instead, it stood straight and tall. And across its face was a crude, wide smile. 6 tally marks carved its chest. And this time, beneath the name Evan, another word had been added. Soon, Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She whispered the truth she had been dreading. "It's not over. It's just begun." The first 6 chalk figures had been discovered in neat, horrifying succession. Each body was marked by the white outline, each victim tied in some way, whether faintly or directly, to Ashwood Lane. 6 lives lost. 6 figures that grew like stains on the conscience of Hollows Point. But by the time the 7th figure appeared, the town had stopped trying to tell itself that this was just a spree, some terrible nightmare that would fade like fog. No, this was ritual. This was escalation. The story of the 7th mark began in whispers, as all the others had, but the difference was simple. Everyone in Hollows Point felt its presence before it was found. The omen. The morning it began, Detective Callum Harker woke to the sound of bells. Not church bells. Hollows Point hadn't rung its parish tower in years, but a thin, metallic chime, echoing faintly from somewhere beyond his window. He opened the curtains, squinting into the pale light of dawn. Across the street, someone had drawn a crooked, smudged chalk line on the pavement. Not a figure. Not yet. Just a line. By mid-morning, more appeared. A curve on one corner. An outline of what looked like a crude hand on another. Kids avoided walking near them. Parents hurried their children past. People muttered that it wasn't safe, that something was about to happen. Callum drove to the station, the hair on his arms prickling. He couldn't shake the sense that the chalk was spreading like veins through the town, each mark leading toward something no one wanted to see. The discovery. It was dusk when the 7th figure finally came into view. A group of teenagers had stumbled on it first, and one of them, a girl named May Collins, screamed so loudly it carried across the marshland. Callum was among the first officers on scene. The body lay at the edge of Ashwood Lane, half hidden by the tall grass. A man this time, middle-aged, his face gray-blue, his eyes wide and fixed toward the horizon. Unlike the others, he hadn't been arranged neatly. His limbs were crooked, as though he'd been dropped rather than placed. But the chalk was different. Instead of a single, simple outline, the figure was surrounded by marks, jagged runes, spirals, and shapes that looked like eyes. It was a circle of symbols, enclosing the 7th chalk figure as though sealing it inside some invisible prison. Callum crouched beside the body, staring at the strange arrangement. "This isn't just a message," he muttered. It's a warning. The widow returns. The coroner arrived, grim as always, but before he could move the body, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. At the far end of Ashwood Lane, a figure in black appeared, walking slowly toward them. The widow. No one spoke her name aloud, but everyone knew her. She had been at the marsh when the first skull was pulled from the net, standing among the reeds in silence. She had appeared at the churchyard when the third figure was found. Always watching. Always uninvited. And now she came again. The officers tensed, but she did not cross the police tape. She simply stopped, lifting her gaze toward Callum. Her eyes, pale and unblinking, held him until he felt his chest tighten. Then she raised one hand and pointed, not at the body, but at the chalk symbols around it. "They're not his," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, almost lost on the wind. "The marks belong to the one who walks after dark. The one you've yet to name." And before anyone could question her, she turned and vanished into the mist. The ledger connection. Back at the station, Callum studied the victim's file. His name was Simon Braithwaite, a local historian, known for his obsession with Hollows Point's oldest records. On his desk, Callum laid out Braithwaite's notes, which had been found in the man's satchel near the body. They were filled with frantic handwriting, sketches of chalk symbols, and references to something called the Ashwood Ledger. The words leapt out at Callum. The ledger counts. The chalk records. Every mark brings us closer. Callum leaned back, rubbing his temples. Braithwaite had been researching the town's forgotten past, and now he was dead, added to the tally himself. There was no coincidence. The killer wasn't just choosing random victims. They were following a pattern written long before Callum was born. The chalk widow's name. That night, Callum visited an old woman who lived on the outskirts of Hollows Point, Elspeth Crane, a local archivist who knew more about the town's buried history than anyone else. When he asked her about the Ashwood Ledger, her face drained of color. "You should have burned that name with the others," she said. "Elspeth, people are dying. Tell me what it means." She hesitated, then sighed, her voice trembling. The ledger was kept by the founding families. A book of debts, not money, but lives. It recorded those who owed something to Ashwood Lane, and those who would pay. Callum's stomach turned. "You mean sacrifices?" Elspeth nodded. The chalk figures were drawn to mark each debt repaid. But no one was supposed to remember. No one was supposed to keep count. "And the widow?" Callum pressed. Elspeth's eyes clouded with fear. She was the last keeper of the ledger. Her name was erased when the pact ended. She shouldn't be here, unless the tally has begun again. The mark on the door. When Callum returned home that night, he froze on his doorstep. Someone had drawn a chalk mark on his door. Not a full figure, just a single white circle with an X carved through its center. He reached out, brushing the chalk with his fingertips, heart hammering. The powder smudged onto his skin, clinging like dust from a grave. He didn't sleep. Not that night. He sat awake in the dark, staring at the mark on the door, waiting for footsteps he prayed wouldn't come. The seventh victim speaks. The following evening, the coroner called with something unusual. "Callum," he said, his voice low, "I don't know what to make of this. Braithwaite, he died of drowning." Callum frowned. Drowning? He was found on dry land. "I know." His lungs were full of marsh water. A silence stretched between them. The implications were chilling. Braithwaite had been taken alive, drowned in the marsh, then dragged to Ashwood Lane to be placed among the chalk. And if the widow was right, if those marks weren't his, then someone else had left them there. The seventh mark. 2 days later, Hollows Point woke to find the seventh chalk figure had changed. The runes and spirals had spread outward, doubling in size, their lines thicker, darker. They no longer looked like random shapes but like something intentional, an incomplete wheel with spaces for more spokes. Callum stood before it at dawn, sickened by the realization. "This isn't the seventh figure," he whispered. "It's the seventh mark." The chalk wasn't just outlining the dead. It was counting, building toward something. And Hollows Point had not yet reached the end of the ledger. The silence of the town. Fear took hold of the town like a choke. Shops closed early. Curtains stayed drawn. The church bell, long silent, was found rung in the night with no hand on the rope. Everywhere Callum went, he felt eyes watching him, not just from people, but from the shadows, from the chalk that seemed to creep into new corners each morning. The widow's words echoed in his head, "The one you've yet to name." If the ledger was counting down, then the killer wasn't finished. The 7th mark was only the beginning of the end. On the 3rd night after Braithwaite's body was found, Callum drove to Ashwood Lane alone. The moon was high, silver and cold, and the chalk symbols gleamed faintly in the dark. He stood at the edge of the 7th figure, staring at the incomplete wheel. And then he heard it. A whisper, low and urgent, carried on the wind. Not words he could understand, but a voice, circling him like breath against the back of his neck. The chalk lines seemed to shiver. Callum stepped back, his breath ragged. He didn't know who the next name in the ledger would be, but he knew one thing. The killer wasn't leaving marks of mourning. They were leaving instructions. The chalk wasn't for the dead. It was for the living. The town of Hollows Point had stopped pretending the chalk was random. The 7th figure proved it wasn't coincidence, and now the chalk had taken on a new life of its own. It wasn't just around the bodies anymore. It was seeping into doorways, sidewalks, the schoolyard. Even the church steps had a mark drawn in the night, though no one claimed to have seen who did it. For Callum Harker, sleep had become impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the symbols spreading, circling, closing in like a net. And at the center of it all stood her, the widow. But the question that haunted him most wasn't why she appeared. It was what she wanted. The widow appears. It was raining when she came again. Callum was at the station, staring at photographs of Simon Braithwaite's chalk-ridden corpse, when one of the younger officers, Franny Miles, burst in. "She's outside," Franny gasped. "Standing in the rain. Just waiting." Callum didn't need to ask who. He grabbed his coat and went out. The widow stood across the street, her black veil plastered to her face by the downpour. Water streaked down her gown, but she didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply raised one hand, crooked like a claw, and beckoned. Against his better judgment, Callum crossed to her. "Why keep showing up?" he demanded. The rain hammered down, soaking his collar. "What do you want from me?" She tilted her head. Slowly, she lifted her veil. For the first time, Callum saw her face. It wasn't grotesque, but neither was it whole. Her skin was pale, scarred in places, her mouth tight and colorless. Her eyes, however, those eyes were like glass. Clouded yet sharp, both blind and all-seeing. "You mistake me for the hand that writes," she rasped. "But I am only the page." "The page?" She stepped closer, voice a low hiss. "The mask I wear is not mine. It belongs to the one who took the ledger, who writes your names in chalk. I only carry what was given." "Who?" Callum pressed. "Who writes the names?" The widow trembled, and for a moment Callum thought she would speak. But then she pulled the veil back over her face, turned, and began to walk away. Not down the street, but toward Ashwood Lane. The chase through the lane. Callum followed, his shoes splashing in puddles. The widow moved quickly despite the storm, her figure vanishing into the mist like a shadow. She led him down the crooked road until they reached the marsh's edge. There, in the rain, a new chalk figure glistened on the ground, 8th, though no body lay within it. The widow stopped at its edge. "It waits," she whispered. Callum's pulse quickened. "Waits for what?" Her voice grew sharper. "For the mask to fall." And before he could ask again, she stepped into the reeds and vanished. The mask's meaning. Back at the station, Callum turned the phrase over in his mind. The mask to fall. He pored through Braithwaite's notes again, searching for references to masks, ledgers, symbols. Finally, buried in a footnote, he found it. The ledger keeper wore the mask of Ashwood, carved from the first tree felled on the lane. It hid the keeper's face and made them nameless. Whoever bore it carried the debts until balance was restored. Callum's breath caught. The widow wasn't just some specter haunting the town. She had been the last bearer of the mask of Ashwood, and though her name had been erased, she still bore its weight. But if the mask wasn't hers anymore, then who carried it now? A body without a name. 2 nights later, the 8th figure was filled. This time, it was a woman. Middle-aged, well-dressed, her wedding ring gleaming under the pale wash of moonlight. But when Callum knelt beside her, something unsettled him. She had no identification, no purse, no wallet. Nothing. Her face seemed familiar, but no one in Hollows Point claimed to know her. The coroner found no matches in records. It was as if the victim had been erased, her name struck from the ledger before she was even found. When Callum reported the discovery to his superior, Chief Ellery, the old man's face turned ashen. "There's no record because she's not meant to have one," Ellery muttered. "The ledger always begins with strangers." "What do you mean?" Ellery looked at him gravely. "Before it comes for us, it takes those who pass through. The nameless. The outsiders. They're the warning before the debt reaches home." The mask in the marsh. That night, Callum drove out to the marsh again, flashlight in hand. He couldn't stop thinking about the mask of Ashwood. He searched through the reeds, the mud, the roots of twisted trees, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain. And then he saw it. Half buried in the mud was a fragment of wood, darkened by water, carved with the faint outline of an eye. Callum brushed it clean, his pulse racing. It wasn't a mask, not anymore. Just a piece of one. But the shape was unmistakable. The mask of Ashwood had been broken. And if it was broken, then perhaps someone had reforged it, or was in the process of doing so. The widow's warning. The following morning, the widow appeared again. This time not in the rain, but at the churchyard, where she stood motionless beside the old stone wall. When Callum approached, she turned toward him, her veil fluttering in the wind. "You found the piece," she said. His throat went dry. "It's real, isn't it? The mask." Her pale hand lifted, trembling. "It was never mine to keep. I wore it only until the debt was sealed. But someone has broken the seal." "Who?" Callum pressed. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "The mask will hide them until the last name is written. When the chalk runs out, the mask falls. That is when you will see them. And until then?" The widow's lips curled into something between a smile and a grimace. "Until then, you hunt shadows. Fear in the streets." Word spread through Hollows Point that the mask of Ashwood had returned. The townsfolk whispered about it at the diner, in the market, outside the shuttered school. Some swore they had seen a figure moving at night with a pale, wooden face. Others claimed the widow herself had been walking the streets, mask or no mask, leaving trails of chalk behind her. Fear grew thick, choking like the marsh fog. And in that fear, Callum realized something crucial. The killer wasn't just hiding behind the mask. They were feeding off the legend. The town's own belief in the mask of Ashwood was what gave it power. The more they whispered, the stronger it became. The mask at his door. 3 nights later, Callum returned home late from the station. He unlocked his front door, stepped inside, and froze. On his kitchen table lay a mask. Not whole, but carved crudely, pieced together from fragments of wood. 2 hollow eyes stared up at him, and the surface was dusted faintly with chalk. A note lay beneath it. Every debt must be paid. Callum sat alone in his darkened kitchen, staring at the mask. He thought of the widow, of her scarred face beneath the veil, of her words, "The mask I wear is not mine. It belongs to the one who took the ledger." If someone had rebuilt the mask, then the ledger was no longer in her hands. It was in someone else's. And as Callum traced the chalk-dusted edges of the crude carving, he realized with sickening certainty. The mask was a warning. The next name in the ledger would not be a stranger. It would be his. The mask sat on Callum Harker's kitchen table like a second face, waiting to be worn. Crude, splintered, its hollow eyes bored into him as if they could already see through his own. A part of him wanted to burn it, to smash it into pieces and cast it into the marsh. But another part knew that destroying it wouldn't end anything. The chalk would keep coming. The ledger would keep writing. Unless he stopped it. The widow's last visit. The following night, he found her at the cemetery, standing before an unmarked grave. The widow's veil shifted in the wind, and for once she did not wait for him to approach. "You have seen the mask," she rasped. "I have," Callum replied. His voice was steady, though his heart was not. "It was left at my table." Her pale hands clenched into fists. Then the ledger has chosen. Its final names are ready to be written. Final? She lifted her face toward him, glassy eyes catching the moonlight. When the ledger begins, it does not stop until balance is struck. 10 names, always 10. 9 have been marked. 1 remains. Callum's chest tightened. You mean? Yes, she interrupted. Yours. The word hit him like a hammer. But then she added, softer, trembling, unless you end it. Unless you make the mask fall before the last name is drawn. The ledger's keeper. Callum returned to the station and dug through the old archives once more. There were fragments of stories, half-forgotten entries in the Braithwaite journals, whispers about the ledger's keeper. The mask of Ashwood was not simply a disguise, it was a contract. Whoever wore it became the keeper of debts, bound to collect them until the slate was wiped clean. But no one knew how the ledger decided whose names to write. Some believed it followed bloodlines. Others said it followed sin. What mattered now was that someone in Hollows Point had reforged the mask and taken up the role. Someone he knew. The widow had been clear. The killer wasn't hiding behind superstition. They were using it. And tonight, Callum vowed he would pull the mask away. The town holds its breath. The storm rolled in just after sunset. The streets were empty, windows shuttered, doors bolted. Even the diner had closed early, its neon sign dark. Hollows Point was holding its breath. Callum drove slowly down Ashwood Lane, the wipers fighting against the sheets of rain. The marsh loomed on either side, swollen with black water. Every shadow looked like a figure waiting. He knew, somehow, that the final act would take place here, where it had all begun. And then he saw it. A chalk figure, fresh and gleaming under the rain, drawn right across the lane. Inside it, a single word. Hark. The keeper revealed. The beam of his flashlight cut through the storm. And there, at the far end of the chalk, stood a figure. The mask covered their face. Not crude anymore, not broken, but whole. A pale wooden visage, smooth, hollow-eyed, carved with the faintest lines of ash and soot. The ledger's keeper. Why me? Callum shouted over the thunder. Why my name? The figure tilted their head, then spoke in a voice warped, distorted by the mask. Because you refuse to forget. Because you drag the past into light when it should stay buried. The ledger does not forgive those who unearth what is owed. The voice was familiar. Sickeningly familiar. Chief Ellery, Callum breathed. The figure did not deny it. Slowly, deliberately, the keeper raised a piece of chalk and began to kneel. The fight in the storm. Callum charged forward. His boot struck the chalk before Ellery could finish the circle, smearing his name into the mud. Ellery lunged, faster than Callum had ever seen the old man move. The two men crashed into the wet earth, the mask's hollow eyes staring inches from Callum's face. You don't understand, Ellery hissed. This town survives because the debt is paid. Every generation, 10 names. If we resist, it takes more. Do you want Hollows Point to vanish into the marsh? Callum fought, grappling with the man's wiry strength. And who decides the names? You. The ledger decides. Ellery roared. I only wear the mask. The mask's wooden edge cut against Callum's cheek as Ellery pressed him into the ground. But Callum's hand shot up, gripping the edge of the mask. It's not the ledger, Callum growled. It's you. And with every ounce of strength, he tore at the mask. The mask falls. The strap snapped. The mask wrenched free. Ellery screamed, not in pain, but in fury, as though the mask itself had been alive. His face beneath was pale, wrinkled, twisted with rage. Without the mask, he seemed smaller, weaker, diminished. The mask fell into the mud between them. The storm howled. Lightning split the sky. And then, from the marsh, came a sound, like voices whispering, dozens of them, rising into a mournful wail. The chalk figure around them dissolved, washed away by the rain. The ledger's hold was broken. The widow's end. From the reeds, the widow stepped forward, veil streaming in the wind. Her glassy eyes fixed on Ellery, who cowered in the mud without his mask. It is over, she said. Her voice carried not just sorrow but finality. The mask has fallen. The ledger ends. Ellery shook his head wildly. No, no, the debt remains. The widow raised her pale hand. You were never the keeper, only the thief. And now the debt takes you. The voices from the marsh swelled, a haunting chorus. Ellery screamed as the water rose unnaturally fast, surging around him, pulling him into the reeds. In moments, he was gone. The widow lowered her veil. My burden is finished, she whispered. Her form seemed to waver, dissolve, until only the veil remained, drifting on the wind. And then she was gone too. The storm passed by dawn. The town of Hollows Point emerged cautiously from its houses, expecting more chalk, more bodies. But none came. The figures stopped. The ledger was closed. Callum gave his statement, though he left much unsaid. Few would believe the truth, that their own chief had worn the mask of Ashwood, that the widow had been its prisoner, that the ledger had demanded 10 names but was cut short at 9. The town buried its dead, marked their graves, and tried to return to life. But Hollows Point would never forget. And neither would Callum. The last chalk. A week later, Callum sat on the steps of his home, staring out at the marsh. He had not slept well since that night. Then he saw it. On his doorstep, faint but real, a line of chalk. Not a figure, not a circle, just a single line, drawn by an unseen hand. He bent down, touched it. It smudged beneath his finger. And he heard, faintly, almost like a memory carried on the breeze. Every debt must be paid. Callum stood, heart heavy. The ledger was closed. The mask destroyed. But debts had a way of returning. He brushed the chalk away with his boot, but his hand lingered on his cheek where the mask had cut him. The scar was still there. And perhaps, he realized, it always would be.